I am Zoé Protat, Director of Programming of the festival, and I have the great pleasure to welcome today Mike Hoolboom, Director of Judy versus Capitalism, and also Judy Rebick, the main protagonist of this superb documentary feature, which is part of our national competition, our 2020 national competition. So hi, Mike. How Judy? And thank you for very much for being with us today. How are you in these strange times? How are you doing?
Melting.
You're melting?
I'm melting. It's very hot in Toronto today.
Like the Wicked Witch of the West. Or was it the East? I can't remember.
I must say I am very humbled by your presence today, even on Zoom, because Mike, you're making films since the beginning of the 80s, numerous documentaries and shorts winning numerous awards. So you're truly a legend in the landscape of Canadian experimental cinema, experimental filmmaking.
Thank you.
And Judy, you're a legend too.
Oh, yes.
Being an essential activist since the 70s, a voice for women's rights, of course, but for all civil rights, social causes, and essentially for a more progressive and inclusive Canada. So first of all, I wanted to talk a bit about the genesis of the film, because I know you're friends in real life. So how did you elaborate the idea of a feature film, and how did it came to life?
Judy, how did it start?
You said, Judy, I think I'd like to make a film about you.
Just like that, casually.
And I thought, and at the time I was working on a book, but it was, Mike asked me before the book was finished.
And it's a memoir about your life.
Memoir.
And
yeah.
you were sending me drafts, right?
Oh, was I? Okay,
so,
I didn't remember.
So as it was going along, so I was sort of attached to these detailed descriptions of years that I didn't know, like when you were 16, 17, when you were selling clothes to Jimi Hendrix, when the Grateful Dead came over and stayed in your place in Montreal, and the Jefferson Starship, not airplane, except for Grace Slick, who had to stay in her own hotel in Montreal. You told stories like that.
More legends, more legends.
Yeah. And I'm very close friends with Velcro Ripper, who's also a filmmaker. And in fact, I met Mike through Velcro. So I called Velcro and I said, what do you think? Like, because, have a friend, I mean, I know what a great filmmaker Mike is, but I also know having a friend make a film about you could be a little dicey. What if you disagree or, And Velcro said, Mike, offering to make a film is like a great painter offering to paint your portrait. That's what he said. So I said, okay, let's go for it. And also, I trust, by that point, Mike and I were pretty close friends, and I trust him, and I know he wouldn't do anything to hurt me. So yeah, so we did it. And it was like a sort of, and the other thing, to be honest, is that Mike is like super busy all the time. The reason he's a legend is that he's constantly making films. Like how he does it, I don't know, but he's like the most productive person I've ever known. And I know some very productive people. And so I thought, well, this is a good chance to spend more time with him. And we did, so it was like an extension of our friendship. Yeah, it was. So I said some things I probably would never have said in public. But because I was talking to Mike, and after a while you forget.
But you're very open-hearted person, Judy. Like when Judy and I get together, she lives in an apartment building on the 15th floor. So Judy talks with people on the elevator, in the lobby, walking down. There's total strangers, It's like, and it's like a image of how society could be, Like we don't have to stay in our little shells, or as we would say now, bubbles,
Yeah.
So it's as if we can always find some kind of ground in which we can meet. And one of the things that I love about your politics is that you've been so willing over and over again to stand in front of, or stand with people who you totally disagree with and have a conversation, Because you're a very smart person, so you can argue your points. You're not going to get buried inside them, and it really allows it to air out instead of this kind of total separation. You know, I think it's very, very rare quality. And it comes out of generosity, I think, and intelligence and self-confidence.
Wow.
No fear.
You're wondering why I let him make a film about me, right?
Yeah, it's a film about you, but it's also a very unconventional approach to documentary. It's more like a lyrical puzzle portrait to catch glimpses of a complex persona. So we love very much here at FNC, you know, you're a regular, Mike. We really love your work and your unconventional approach to filmmaking. Can you talk a bit about the diverse footage that is present in the film and their articulation? So we have some Super 8 footage and personal archives and the articulation of everything.
Yeah, I didn't know whether Judy was going to be in the film or not. I mean, of course it's going to be about her, but you know, we're made of so many different influences and so many different people, and our environment you know, impacts us a lot. Like maybe the whole film could just be like buildings or landscape, you know? And so I thought about the film as like, what kind of a place would Judy live in? And I thought it would be like a city of women, where women would be not just the mayor and every city councillor, but also the bus driver, the post person, that, you know? So could I start creating something like a ground, a setting, for instance, in which, you know, Judy's words would float over. And then as time went on, it seemed more and more unreasonable or even like perverse to say like, well, Judy, you know, you can't be in your own film. So, you know, and as we were hanging out anyway, so it's, you know, slowly, you know, we gathered some footage, and Judy spent a lot of time in front of cameras. So what's really great is that, you know, this question of consent is very in the air with documentaries these days. Like Judy, because Judy understands how she's going to look and how she's going to appear, I mean, even though the camera's shaking like crazy, you know, I feel like there's real consent there, you know, and of course she's very, you know, poised as always. So it was very easy.
The film is divided in 6 chapters with very evocative titles. We have abortion, weight, family. How did you define the structure?
You know, I spent a long time editing, and then I sent it to friends, and they said it was completely incoherent and they couldn't figure out anything about the film, and that I should totally start over again, or maybe you're the wrong person, and then I fell into a terrible depression and I gave up, and I thought, okay, the film's gone, it's lost. And then somewhere in that pit, you know, it's like, oh, maybe there could be 6 chapters. They don't have to connect, you know, they can just be like, okay, now chapter 2, meanwhile over here, you know, which is more like how we live, you know. We have this Zoom call, or we see this movie, and then we talk to a friend, and then we have a coffee, and then we're somewhere, you know, or now we're on the subway. And so that felt fine, you know. And, you know, Judy's had a very big life. This movie just touches like really a few moments of it. And there's so many other things that could have been part of it. So.
And the film is as much as about a public figure as about a woman who has gone through many traumas and personal challenges. For the Judy you wanted to put on screen, how did you work on the balance between the personal and the public figure? That's for you, Mike, and after that I have another one for Judy on the same subject.
Well, I could imagine Judy could answer that question, because, you know, as she says in the film, like the personal is political. Yeah. And I see, the thing is, you know, I think what I was saying before is just hanging out with Judy is to live inside a feminist paradigm. I mean, it's not just an idea. It's not just something that happens like when Judy makes a speech in front of a lot of people. Like, it's happening every day, all the time. You know, it's a lived and embodied politic. And I think that's so important. Judy, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, well, yeah, yes and no. I mean, I think that
there's also organization.
I'm more open than most public figures. It's part of my what I believe in. And also because I'm very conscious of my privilege and my personal power. And so I'm always trying to open up. So like I'm teaching right now online. So I'm always making jokes and talking about personal stuff so that my students won't relate to me like some, you know, grand figure or something. And I've always been like that. So just been myself on air as well. I was just saying to a friend, like, you know, I was on a national TV show for 5 years debating right-wingers every night of the week. Oh my God, I can't believe I did that. But anyway.
You're still alive.
I know,
I did. And I never, but I always respected them, you know, and I also found myself that I often liked people on the other side of the table better than I liked the people on my side. You know, the thing that Mike was saying about not assuming because you disagree with someone, they're a terrible person. Because it's not that sometimes they are, but sometimes the person you agree with is a terrible person too, right? So your politics doesn't necessarily define who you are as a person. And I learned that a lot. I learned that, especially when I was doing Face Off, which was the show I was on. So I tried to be, you know, as much, I mean, I do perform when I'm speaking. It's a performance for sure, but I try to be as close to who I am. I don't put on an act. I've never put on an act. Not never, but very rare. The only time I put on an act is if I'm in a real fight, you know, then you have to put your dukes up, you know, and that's not really me anymore. But
Judy, wouldn't you say when you were working with the clinic, you know, on Harvard Street, like you had to bring together a lot of groups into the room, some of which were radical feminist groups, and you know, that was hard, right? Yeah. And somehow you had to find a way to not to cut everyone off, like to say like, no, we're all part of this movement, and we need everybody in the room, right?
Yeah, and but in those days it was like, because I understood that in order to win this fight, we needed a broad coalition.
Yeah.
And so you had to put up with these people that you couldn't stand, that you didn't think were decent human beings, you know, because they had power or they had money or whatever it might be, and they were pro-choice. So I had to work with people, right, you know, like Pat Carney, who was my enemy during the free trade fight, but she was a very strong pro-choice. She was a conservative senator, pro-choice fighter. And what we learned in that fight too was often conservative women were better allies than liberal or even some NDP women. So that, you know, in those days, I would put aside everything for the politics, right? And partly I was dissociative. That is, I was dissociated from my feelings. So that was, it's like a superpower in terms of the pro-choice movement, both because I wasn't ever afraid. I never felt afraid. And so I could stand up to the physical threats, of which there were many, and the other threats, like to, you know, whatever. There were a lot of threats working in the pro-choice movement. I could stand up to that, but also I could put up with, you know, what I would have called then and probably call now bourgeois women who were really very privileged people who didn't acknowledge their privilege at all, because we needed them to, because we need a lot of money to win the struggle because of the court cases. So I think I was like that then, but for a different reason. You know, now I think I'd be more generous to those women. I'd understand better the fights they had to wage to be where they are. I wouldn't agree with them anymore, but I'd be more sympathetic.
And Judy, you already addressed some those deep personal issues before in books.
Yes.
But now it was through a movie. Was it difficult to open up on these issues in a feature film?
No, because it was Mike, right? That's the sort of weird part of this is that I was just talking to Mike and he knew all about it already. So I wasn't, you know, I know it seems odd, but it was easier for me to talk about being diagnosed with multiple personalities and being abused by my father than it was talk about my weight, which I never talk about publicly. Like this film is the first time I've ever talked about my struggles with weight in public. And the only reason I did that, I didn't even think about it, was just, well, I'm talking to Mike, right? So, and I don't think we'd ever really talked about that. So yeah, so there was a kind of lack of consciousness about it. Not the first time I saw the movie, because I agree it was a bit incoherent, and I thought, okay, I don't understand Mike's filmmaking and whatever.
Neither did anyone else.
But the second time, I mean, the film that we have now, more or less, and I saw that cut, I thought, wow, like this is really something, because he really captured all these parts of me that, you know, that it was a very intimate portrait. And probably, I don't think anybody else could have done that. I think partly it's his approach to filmmaking and how close friends we are. The trust between us. Yeah. Which I think is probably pretty rare when somebody's...
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I was deeply touched by the movie. It addresses very important topics for everyone. I think, especially in these times of profound polarization, in which basic human rights are threatened, even in our so-called Western democracies. So, Judy, you have been an activist since the 70s. How do you film activism is doing nowadays? What were the issues back then? What are the issues now? What are the differences?
Well, first of all, I want to say that I'm feeling very hopeful because I see a rise of activism and of radicalism. People who are saying everything has to change. You know, the Black Lives Matter movement, by talking about abolish the police, abolish the carceral system, they're making us all rethink how to change things. Even me, you know, and I've been a radical my whole life, but I've gotten more radical since the Black Lives Matter upsurge, because they're pushing me to rethink everything, you know, to rethink all of our ways that we organize and that we do things. You know, like their whole approach to leadership, I think is beautiful. It's what we wanted to do in second wave feminism, but everybody understands that term in my generation of feminism, but we didn't succeed. We tried and we worked hard to do it, but we didn't succeed. And
Can you talk more about what that is?
Yeah,
how leadership works?
Okay, yeah, like when I was president of the National Action Committee on the Status of Women, I made it a priority, and because women of color had been fighting at the local level, Black women and Indigenous women and women of color had been fighting for representation in the women's movement. And so I decided when I became president that was going to be a priority for me, as well as healing the division with Quebec that had come up during Meech Lake, right? And so I, along with the Women of Color Caucus in NAC, really worked hard to change the face of NAC. And we succeeded in doing that. When I left as president, a woman of color, Sunira Tabani, became president, and lots of women of color were involved. You know, we can talk about what happened after that. So we started to work on anti-racist issues, and the Black women were very well organized back then too, and fighting for not just representation, but also a different voice, that the women's movement had to have the voice of all women, not just of white middle-class women. And so we began to have that fight, and probably did better in Canada than certainly they did in the States. But, you know, we didn't succeed because we were well ahead of our time. So I think that's one thing where the understanding of racism and the depth of racism in the society and the extent to which capitalism is rooted in racism, like the term racial capitalism, which has emerged in this Black Lives Matter movement, I think is a huge advance over the way we understood racism. Most of us, you know, you read James Baldwin, and I mean, he was writing in the 60s and the 70s, and he understood this, but I didn't understand it, you know? So the great Black intellectuals understood it, and Angela Davis and so on, but it was a very minority understanding. Now I think we're all starting to understand it, and that is huge. That's as huge as the understanding of patriarchy that we were able to expose in our generation, right? That we were able to expose the way in which patriarchy had a grasp on capitalism, and in fact, capitalism is based on patriarchy. Similarly, based on racism. So I think that the understanding of these issues is much more sophisticated. I think the ways of organizing are brilliant. The network organizing, we are all, you know, the thing I quote this before, I saw a clip on CNN a few days like after the first or second big demonstration. And this woman says to a reporter, "You're looking for Martin Luther King, but you're not going to find Martin Luther King here. We're all Martin Luther King." And she turns and shows all the people. And it's Black people, yes, young Black people who are leading, but there's every kind of race, ethnicity, gender. It was beautiful. And these demonstrations are beautiful, I think, because they're multiracial, they're led by young Black people. It's just wonderful. So I feel very positive. On the other hand, I think capitalism is dead or dying. And we don't have an alternative economic system yet. And so I'm worried, that's where my worry is. And I think people are working on this in Europe especially, but also in the United States. But we have to have more imaginaries, and this is where I think filmmaking is important too, more imaginaries about what that new world could look like and how we're going to achieve it. And I think in the 60s, we were very clear about that. We were wrong, but we were very clear. We had a very clear theory about how change is going to happen, right? Whereas now I think we're less clear, but we're modeling it better in our movements. So I don't know, maybe that's too long an answer, but that's...
Not at all. Just back to the film a little bit. You had the international premiere in Rotterdam in January, just before everything went down.
Yeah.
So, and then after the film traveled quite a lot, even virtually. So have you noticed any difference in the reception depending on the country or the event? What were the reactions to the film?
I mean, we haven't traveled with the film, so when you're sitting in a room with a number of people, you can tell right away. Oh yes, like there's a way in which even fragmented films, in which everyone is taking their own journey, it creates an us, a feeling of us, and there's a certain mood, and you can really feel when a film is dying, especially when it's your film. But we just haven't had the opportunity to sit in theaters, but we're going to do it actually in a couple of weeks. A couple of weeks. Yeah, we're actually going to sit in a theater. Like, how about that? So it's hard to tell. But I mean, even though Judy's recounting some historical events, so-called, the fight for women's right to choose, or the right to have control over their own bodies. Of course, this is still a struggle that's going on. Like it's horrifyingly, it's ongoing. It's not just from the past, And I can imagine that in different countries where it's playing, it's going to be felt very differently. In Poland, for instance, than it is, say, here in Canada, where I think because of the women's movement, even the right wing, most of the right wing feels like, yes, but abortion is settled. Like that, we're never returning to that ever again. Wouldn't you say, Judy?
Yeah, for now.
For now.
For now,
okay.
Yeah.
The right wing the problem is the right wing right now is getting, not in Canada, we don't see it in Canada, but it always affects Canada. So it's growing in the United States, the extreme right, I mean. The extreme right and the anti-choice right is getting stronger in a way in the United States, or getting more vicious, if that's possible. And if we lose Roe v. Wade at the Supreme Court, and that's the danger now, right? The 73 decision that made abortion more or less legal in the United States, that's going to affect Canada. So we have to be careful. And even in New Brunswick, the New Brunswick election, where conservatives got elected, they already have very little access to abortion. I think they only have one clinic that they find.
Okay.
And so, so we always have to be vigilant.
Justement, si je peux passer au français avec vous, Judy, vu qu'on parle de la question de l'avortement, vous avez accompagné donc le célèbre médecin Henry Morgentaler dans sa croisade pour légaliser l'avortement au Canada. Vous étiez porte-parole pour sa clinique à Toronto.
Ouais.
Et vous étiez présente lors du fameux attentat de 1983, des images d'archives qu'on voit en fait en boucle dans le film. Peut-être quelques mots en fait sur cet homme et sur le combat que vous avez partagé.
D'accord. Pour moi, Dr. Morgentaler était une figure très importante, évidemment, historiquement, c'est évident, mais aussi personnellement, parce que lui, il était très... il avait, je ne sais pas si on dit en français, un cœur ouvert, un open heart. Il était très ouvert aux émotions, il est très, très ouverte. Et moi, à l'époque, j'étais complètement fermée, complètement dissociée. Donc, j'ai vu un homme qui est très courageux, très courageux, mais à la même fois, il sent très, très profondément, il a des sentiments. Donc, il a eu évidemment, le rôle, il m'a dit, j'adore ton énergie, Judy, je veux que tu aies le porte-parole du clinique. C'était la première fois que j'ai rencontré lui. Donc, c'était instant. Il m'a demandé d'être porte-parole pour la clinique. Et j'ai passé beaucoup de temps avec lui. Et évidemment, on a eu beaucoup de désaccords avec lui et son avocat aussi, parce qu'on a discuté tout. Mais à la même fois, il veut qu'on continue notre amitié. Et j'ai trouvé ça très, très touchant. Et donc, je crois, lui, il a joué un rôle si important pour les femmes de ce pays. On ne peut pas même dire l'importance de son position. Mais pour moi, personnellement, c'était aussi une relation très, très importante, une amitié très importante parce que c'est me montrer une autre façon de faire des choses, de faire de la politique. Donc.
Judy, you should tell the story about the lawyer, Morgentaler's lawyer, that you wanted to get fired.
Oh, OK.
Yeah, en français.
En français, OK.
Oui, oui.
Donc, son avocat, qui était excellent comme avocat, donc avocat, encore très courageuse comme avocat, mais à cette époque, il a gagné le jury trial, okay? Mais on attend le Cour suprême et lui, il était l'avocat pour quelqu'un qui essayait d'éliminer le syndicat dans une usine particulière. Donc, c'était contre les syndicats. Okay? Et nous avions très, très peur parce que les syndicats étaient un allié
oui.
Très important pour nous. Donc, moi, mon position était, il faut terminer l'accord avec Morris Manning et trouver un autre avocat, okay? Parce qu'on ne peut pas aller contre les syndicats. Et je suis allée à Montréal pour rencontrer avec Morgentaler avec 2 dirigeants de syndicats, femmes. Mais il a dit, c'est pas possible, il est mon avocat, il est bon, il est important pour le mouvement, je ne vais pas le faire. He's a hired hand. Ça n'a rien à faire avec moi, ce qu'il fait. Et moi, j'ai dit, OK, ça je dois dire en anglais parce que je ne sais pas comment parler. J'ai dit, if it was, and I named a neo-Nazi lawyer, if it was that guy, if he was defending that guy, a Nazi, if he was defending a Nazi, then you wouldn't have this position. Of course, he was a concentration camp survivor. J'ai dit ça à lui et les dirigeants du syndicat étaient horreur. J'ai dit ça. Maintenant, moi aussi, j'ai l'horreur que j'ai dit ça. Quand il me demandait de prendre une boire en bas, et j'étais certain, il m'a dit, je veux terminer notre relation. Mais il a dit le contraire. Il m'a dit, Judy, I know you took your position because you think it's the best thing for the movement. And I hope you know that I'm taking this position because I believe it's the best thing for the movement. But what's important is that we retain our friendship. C'était si émouvant. Et aussi, j'ai appris une leçon importante, très importante, que c'est possible d'avoir des désaccords fondamentaux, mais encore être alliés dans la même lutte. Et c'est un moment très important pour moi. Ouais.
Merci beaucoup, Mike et Judy, d'avoir été avec nous aujourd'hui. Thank you so much. So Judy versus Capitalism is part of our national competition. You can catch it online on FNC's website. And Mike, you have also a short in FNC this year. Can you say a few words about the Zen basketball?
Oh, that's Yes, I followed the secret life of the greatest defensive basketball player who had ever played the game. And he works with great diligence on Fogo Island, actually, in the easternmost part of Canada. And even though he practices diligently for many hours each day, even through the winter, he has never yet sunk a single basket, even though he tries each time. It's very special, very special.
So Zen Basketball is available online as part of the national competition program 1 in the shorts. And yeah, thank you again. So if you like this program, please don't be shy. Share it on social media. Follow FNC on Facebook and Instagram.